Hi everybody, and welcome to week 2 of Communication and Media and to your first online lecture. So typically these online lectures will be provided in pretty short video clips like this one, where I'll go through the slides and there will be one or two little exercises that you'll need to stop the video for, or in this case there'll be the video will stop and then there's the exercise and then you have to come back and there'll be a second video. So do make sure that you watch both videos in order to get the answers to the questions that come at the end of this first part. And if you've watched part 2, I hope you've come back and started with part 1 properly. Alright, so this will all make sense very shortly. Now this week we're introducing the field of communication and media. So field is a word that's commonly used in academic scholarship and academic research and in university studies. So don't be too fazed by it. We'll get into what that means a little bit more as we get along. So firstly, let's just go through quickly what we're going to talk about in this week's lecture. First of all, some ideas about what is communication. We've already started talking about that. Some of the intellectual traditions of the field of communication and media, and the idea of it as a discipline, some forms of communication and some types of communication. So first questions first. What is communication? So we've got a couple of definitions here. There are others, but these two are great places to start. So the first one is a little more complex. It's describing communication as a process through which people acting together create, sustain and managed meanings through the use of verbal and non-verbal signs and symbols in a particular context. Let's unpack that a little bit. Okay, so first of all, it's people. Obviously, we're talking about human communication here, not animal communication. Acting together. So communication is something that requires more than one person, often many people. Now, together means that these things that communication does, in other words, creation, sustaining and managing meanings, are done jointly. So that's really important because the idea of meaning being something that is jointly agreed upon or maybe contested is something that's kind of fundamental to some important ideas about communication. So create, sustain and manage meanings. So we create meanings, we sustain them, in other words we keep them, or sometimes we challenge them, sometimes they might evolve, and that's all what we mean by talking about manage meanings. Now how do we do that? We use verbal and non-verbal signs. Non-verbal signs, obviously things like alphabets, images and so on. Signs and symbols, for now we don't need to get into too much detail about the difference between those two. And the last phrase, particularly important also, in a particular context. Okay, so a word or a picture or a signifier of some other type, for example a hand gesture, has a particular meaning in a particular context. Context here can refer to a certain time or a certain place or a certain culture, and this will become very obvious to you as we proceed through the course, and you probably can think of some examples already. Okay, the second definition here is a little bit more straightforward. The exchange of messages between members of the same species. So Denisi here is obviously I hope you remember, the principal author and editor of the textbook for this course. So Denisi's restricted communication to this idea of being between members of the same species, so not necessarily human. And here, of course, we can refer to the fact that humans aren't the only ones that communicate, but humans have a specific and very complex form of communication, involving not only physical gestures and not only sounds, but obviously forms of literacy and image making, and of course technological forms of communication. The exchange of messages. Again, the word exchange kind of relates to that idea of how we act together. In other words, communication is not something that is from an author to a reader or from a broadcaster to an audience. right? Communication really occurs in the connection between those two. There's 4 communication skills that we can use to summarize the whole gamut of communication. Obviously, speaking and listening are very commonly included when we think about communications, and non-verbal communications. These can be deliberate, or sometimes we can communicate involuntarily through things like our facial expressions, or the way we sit and how we hold ourselves. Another skill that's included here is a skill called thinking, which doesn't sound like it's communication because it happens like in our interior, but thinking is a skill that's required because thinking is required whenever we interpret forms of communication and also whenever we generate forms of communication. Okay, intellectual traditions of the field. So the communication and media draws upon 2 major what we call fields. So one is the social sciences, and this includes a series of disciplines. So one is psychology, the study of the mind and behavior. One is anthropology. One is economics. One is political science, and one is sociology. Sorry, I had to pause there momentarily because my phone involuntarily communicated with me. Thank you, Siri, and just interrupted my flow of thought there. And so let's just go back over this different disciplines in the social sciences that we draw upon. So psychology, referring to what happens, but mostly inside the mind of the brain. Anthropology, which looks at the study of human beings, including language, conventions, and can often involve spending a lot of time with a certain group or a certain subculture or those sorts of things. Economics, the way that goods and services are produced and distributed and consumed. So money, ownership, those sorts of things. Political science, so the study of how politics works. So not only elections, but also how societies are governed, and how that might vary, for example, in non-democratic societies, where there is different forms of interaction between the governed and those who govern them. And lastly, sociology, which studies society and social behaviour, and it's a very broad field in itself. So the other field that communications and media draws its traditions from are the humanities. Now, the humanities have a very long history, longer than the social sciences, and go way back to ancient Greek and people like Aristophanes and Aristotle and so on. So the particular disciplines from the humanities that are relevant for communications especially, things like rhetoric, which is how speaking or writing can be used persuasively, dialectics, how you can have a sustained, reasonable debate about something that we disagree upon, poetics, the study of literary and linguistic techniques, philosophy, which is the study of knowledge and how do we know what we know and what it is to be alive and what it means to be alive, so pretty deep stuff there, and aesthetics, which is the study of beauty and taste. Okay, so the field of media and communications evolved in the 20th century, as has been discussed in last week's tutorials, particularly from like the 30s onwards. We called it communication in the 1940s, and it had a lot to, it owed a lot to recent happenings in the field of media broadcasting, especially radio broadcasting, and the impact that had on mass audiences. Media studies as a term became more important from the 1970s onwards. Of course, television rose into prominence in the 1970s, and towards the end of the 70s, we started to see the arrival of computing. Now, there's no really universally accepted structure for the field of media and communications, which is not something that you really need to worry about too much. And for the moment, you just might want to reflect upon the fact that media and communications is a very multidisciplinary field. So it draws upon a lot of other intellectual traditions, and it influences the practices of many industries. And that, is pretty clear when you think about how so many industries use and require and rely upon different modes of communication. So forms of communication, we can talk about verbal communication, the study of language and linguistics, specifically things like speech patterns and grammatical structures or syntax, which if anyone studied a foreign language would be very familiar to you. Syntax, the order of words and lexicon, the vocabulary. And the last one, which is one that we're going to focus on today, is called register, which is a really great word to use. And it talks to, well, register refers to the way speech can be appropriate or otherwise for certain contexts and on certain occasions. For example, a formal occasion, say like something like a wedding speech could be very, very formal, or sometimes they can be quite informal when the best man or the bridesmaid decides to tell a few jokes. Formal speeches in formal settings, so some of these are required to be formal, so like in a court of law, or informal settings, and that could be anything from maybe a semi-formal setting like in a workplace, or a very informal setting like say how a sporting team might chat in a changing rooms, or what might happen in a lounge room, or those sorts of things, families chatting or so on. Now, I want you to go and have a look at this article, which is called Trump's Rhetoric, A Triumph of Inarticulacy. Now, it's by The Guardian, and let me just pause a second and I'll get it up for you on the screen so you can see it. And there it is. So here's the article. Now, what I will need you to do is go and find the article, read it, and I want you to reflect upon these few questions here. Okay, so while you're reading that article, I want you to think about these things. So first of all, the article highlights 3 characteristics of President Trump's communication style. What are they? So what is in the author's view, what are some kind of like specific characteristics or mannerisms or elements of President Trump's style? In the author's opinion, this has some advantages. Can you list some of the advantages that the author suggests President Trump gains by employing this particular communication style? The third item to reflect upon is the different registers of speech that the article discusses. So one is sounding presidential. What are some of the others? All right. And fourthly, how does the article compare or contrast equivocation with contradiction? So that's a quite specific question that you'll need to look at the article carefully to determine your answer to. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of the online lecture. So when you've finished reviewing the article, come back to Learn Online and you can download the second half of the lecture for this week, which will begin with us reviewing the reading.